The first thing Caleb Foster noticed that morning wasn't the cold. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a place after a long night, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. Out in the foothills above Willow Bend, Montana, the old homestead sat between pine-covered slopes and a thin ribbon of frozen creek. Caleb stepped off the porch, boots touching hard ground, and the silence wrapped around him like a long, steady exhale. Years ago, Caleb had walked other ground as a ranger on wildfire crews. Back then, it never quite lasted. Radios crackled, timber popped, engines roared. Now, medically retired, lungs scarred and back stiff, he'd come home to this small patch of land to start over. He was still getting used to mornings without sirens or smoke. That day began like any other. A short walk around the property, check the barn, the fence line, and the gate by the trees. Simple habits that helped anchor his thoughts. The sky was just turning from ink to pale gray. Frost traced every fence rail. In the distance, a crow called once, then stopped. He rounded the back corner of the barn, expecting nothing more than old boards and tangled weeds. That's when he saw her. At first, she was just a shape in the shadow of a cottonwood. Then his eyes adjusted, and the shape became a body. Fur dulled, flank thin, a hind leg stretched at an odd angle. A short length of chain disappeared into frozen mud. A bobcat. Not just any bobcat. Scout. He knew her before his mind caught up with the memory. The faint notch along her ear, the pattern of spots along her side. Years earlier, he'd pulled her, half-burned and trembling from the edge of a wildfire line. Nursed her through that first brutal season. Released her when she was strong enough to run the ridges again. She'd been a wild neighbor ever since, slipping past his property at dusk like a quiet promise that some things do survive. Now she lay chained behind his barn. Caleb's breath caught. For a heartbeat, Montana vanished. He was back in the fire, heat beating against his gear, sky orange, radio spitting someone's last clear sentence before turning to static. His chest tightened. The air tasted wrong. He dropped to his knees anyway. Up close, the damage was clearer. The chain had rubbed the fur raw around Scout's leg, leaving the skin angry and swollen. Frost clung to her whiskers. Each breath lifted her ribs just a fraction. When he whispered her name, one ear twitched, slow and heavy, but her eyes stayed half-lidded. He slid a hand under her shoulder. Her body felt too light for a bobcat that once moved through these hills like a streak of muscle and confidence. The links were buried in frozen earth. He worked them loose with stiff fingers until the clasp gave way. Metal clinked softly in the cold air. For a moment, there were only two sounds. Her shallow breathing and his. A ranger and a bobcat, both a little older, both carrying the marks of things they'd walked through. He wrapped her in an old flannel blanket he found in the barn, the same one his father used to keep in the truck during calving season. Scout didn't struggle. She didn't purr or growl. She simply allowed herself to be lifted, trusting the familiar scent, the familiar voice. As he carried her toward the truck, Caleb felt something settle in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. The realization that survival isn't a straight line. It bends. It circles back. Sometimes the life you once helped save finds its way back to your doorstep, asking for help again in a language made of eyes and breath and silence. He laid her gently on the truck seat, tucking the blanket around her paws, then rested his hand for one small moment on her side. The rise and fall under his palm was faint, but real. "All right, girl," he murmured. "We're not done yet." He didn't know who had chained a bobcat behind his barn or why. That would come later. All he knew in that moment was simple. Get her to help. Do the next right thing, 1 mile at a time. As the engine turned over and the gravel road opened ahead of him, the homestead disappeared in the side mirror. The small wildlife clinic down in Willow Bend waited somewhere beyond the bend in the highway, lights just beginning to warm the dark. If you've ever had a moment when someone or something you thought you'd lost stepped back into your life needing you again, stay with this story. In the next part, we'll walk with Caleb through those clinic doors, into the long night, where one ranger's past, one bobcat's future, and a town's quiet heart begin to tangle together. By the time Caleb reached the little wildlife clinic outside Willow Bend, the sky was still more night than morning. A single porch light burned over the door, casting a yellow circle onto the snow. Inside that circle, with the engine ticking as it cooled, he sat for one long breath, hand resting on the bobcat's blanket-wrapped side. Scout's ribs rose and fell in shallow waves. That was his mini-hook. One man, one wild heart, and a building that suddenly felt like the most important place on earth. He carried her in the way you carry something you're afraid to drop, even if it doesn't weigh much. The reception bell gave a small, startled ring as the door opened. Warmth washed over them, not hot, just a gentle difference from the cold outside. Pine cleaner, coffee, and old paper charts. Ordinary smells in an extraordinary moment. Dr. Grace Holloway stepped out from the back room, wiping her hands on a towel. She didn't ask many questions at first. She saw the chain marks, the dullness in Scout's eyes, the way Caleb's jaw was clenched too tightly. She simply nodded toward the exam room. "Let's get her settled," she said. The explanation of what was wrong came quietly, piece by piece, as Grace worked. Infection around the leg, where the metal bit into the skin. Dehydration. Weight loss that told a longer story than one bad night. She checked Scout's gums, her heartbeat, and her temperature. An IV line slid into place, and a fluid bag began its slow drip. Each small action pulled Scout 1 inch further from the edge. While Grace moved, Caleb stood at the corner of the table, fingers pressed white into the stainless steel. The overhead lights reflected off the metal, harsh and bright. For a moment, they might as well have been helicopter lights over a fire line. Heat, smoke, a radio squawking his name. Another ranger shouted coordinates over a roar that swallowed half the words. The memory hit without warning. The exam room tilted. Sound folded in on itself. The bobcat in front of him blurred into the young one he'd carried out of burning timber years before. The one who dug tiny claws into his jacket in sheer panic. "Caleb!" Grace's voice cut through the noise. She placed her hand near his on the table, not touching at first, just close enough for him to feel the nearness. "Hand flat," she said softly. "Right here. Feel the steel. Name 3 things you can hear." He swallowed, listened. The soft beep of the monitor, the slow drip of fluids. A heater fan is humming in the corner. "Now, 3 things you can feel," she added. The cold metal under his palm, the pull in his lower back, the rough weave of the blanket where his other hand rested on Scout's shoulder. The fire receded. The room returned. He breathed again. That moment, one ranger grounding himself while a bobcat fought for her life, became the example of what this part of the story is about. 2 paths of healing, side by side. One visible on a monitor, one hidden in a man's chest. As the hours passed, small signs appeared. Scout's ear twitched when Grace adjusted the blanket. Her tail moved once when the heater clicked on. Numbers on the screen steadied. Outside, the first pale ribbon of dawn slipped between the clinic blinds. Caleb watched her, seeing more than an injured bobcat. He saw the burned kit from years ago who had limped through a second chance. He saw his own lungs, scarred from smoke, still filling. He realized healing rarely arrives in grand moments. It comes in drips and breaths and choices to stay present when every piece of you wants to run. The fresh perspective that morning was simple. Survival wasn't just about getting out of the fire. It was about what you did with the days that followed. For Scout, it meant trusting human hands one more time. For Caleb, it meant letting someone steady him when the past came roaring back. A small lesson settled quietly between them. You don't have to be unhurt to be useful. You can be limping a little, breathing a little harder, and still show up for a life that needs you. As the sun finally crept over the hills, Grace touched Caleb's shoulder. "She's not out of the woods," she said, "but she's fighting." He nodded, eyes on the rise and fall of Scout's chest. "Then I'll stay," he replied, "however long it takes." Outside in the waiting room, footsteps and hushed voices began to gather. Neighbors, friends, people who had heard just enough to come sit in the quiet with them. Stay with this story. In the next part, we'll step out of that exam room and into the hallway, where a small Montana town begins to wrap its arms around a ranger, a bobcat, and a fragile hope. If this has stirred something gentle in you, let it keep you company as we walk on. In towns like Willow Bend, news doesn't arrive with breaking banners. It arrives on a low voice over a kitchen table, in a quick call between sisters, in the way someone pauses at the grocery store door and says, "Did you hear about the ranger and the bobcat at Grace's clinic?" By mid-morning, the story had started its slow, steady walk through the valley. Haas didn't know every detail, just enough. A retired ranger had found the wild bobcat he once rescued, chained and abandoned behind his barn. She was fighting for her life at the little wildlife clinic by the highway. That was all it took. When Caleb stepped out into the clinic's waiting room to stretch his back, he expected empty chairs and a humming soda machine. Instead, he found 3 people sitting quietly, like they were waiting for a prayer service to begin. Eleanor was there first, a folded quilt on her lap in deep greens and browns that matched the hills. She'd taught half the town's children their times tables, Caleb included. She rose as he entered. "I heard she's here," she said, voice low. "Thought she might need something warm under her." She didn't say, "the bobcat." She said, "she," the way people talk about someone they've known for years. Beside her sat Marcus, a widower from up the road, a jar of homemade salve in his big hands, pine resin and beeswax, his late wife's old recipe for burns and cracked skin. He placed it on the counter like an offering. "Don't know if it'll help a bobcat," he muttered, "but it helped my boys when they fell out of trees." The third was a teenage girl, Nora, clutching a dog-eared photograph. She'd snapped it on an old camera one summer evening, a bobcat crossing the dirt road, tail high in the dusty light. Scout, most likely. The picture had lived on her bedroom wall ever since. "I just wanted to know if she's okay," Nora said, eyes darting toward the exam room door. Grace came out, wiping her hands, and explained in simple, steady words what was happening inside. Fluids, antibiotics, heat, rest. No guarantees, but signs of fight. As she talked, she answered questions before they formed. No, Scout wouldn't become a pet. Bobcats weren't built for sofas and backyards. Even injured, they were meant to stay wild in all the ways that matter. Yes, there were sanctuaries where a cat with a damaged leg could stalk, climb, and choose when to be seen. That was the goal if she made it through. Listening, Caleb realized something. The story of this bobcat wasn't just his. Scout had been moving through other lives for years, glimpsed on back roads, mentioned around dinner tables, pointed out to grandkids from porch swings. She had been a quiet neighbor in a town that mostly kept its heart tucked in. Now that the heart was showing itself. Eleanor spread the quilt on a chair near the wall heater, smoothing each corner with careful hands. "I can sit a while," she told Grace. "Keep an eye on that drip if you need to rest your feet." For a woman who'd started to wonder if the world still needed her, that small task felt like a doorway back into usefulness. Marcus stayed longer than he'd planned, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup, shoulders loosening as he swapped stories with Caleb about long nights on the road and the strange comfort of having an animal to look after. Nora asked question after question about bobcat tracks, bobcat eyes, bobcat lives, as if learning the details would help hold Scout here a little longer. The reflection that settled in that little waiting room was simple and soft. Healing may begin in an exam room, but it rarely stays there. It spills out into quilts stitched in quiet houses, jars of salve carried in calloused hands, and teenagers taking photos of wild neighbors instead of scrolling past another screen. The fresh perspective was this: you don't have to know someone well to show up for them. Sometimes it's enough to know they share your valley, your sky, your weather. A small lesson rose gently between them, and maybe for us listening too. Compassion doesn't always look like big speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes it's just driving down to a clinic with the one thing you know how to offer, then sitting in a chair and keeping watch. As afternoon light thinned and the clinic grew still again, Caleb stepped outside with Marcus. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, ticking like a clock. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine echoed along the county road, a sound that would soon carry a different kind of meaning. Because if someone had chained a bobcat behind his barn, there was more to this story than an injury and a quilt. In the next part, we'll walk with Caleb and the wildlife officer as they follow tracks in the snow and question in their own hearts into an investigation that reshapes what Willow Bend thought it knew about its hills. If this picture of a small town quietly gathering has warmed something in you, let it stay close as we go on. The morning after the clinic filled with quilts and coffee, Caleb drove back up the narrow road to his homestead with someone in the passenger seat. Beside him sat Ryan Hayes, the wildlife officer for that stretch of Montana. The mini-hook was quiet but clear. Two men heading toward an ordinary barn, knowing that what they found in the snow might change what they believed about their hills. The sky was a flat winter blue. Snow still clung to the shaded edges of the lane, pressed into ridges by truck tires. Neither of them talked much on the way up. Caleb kept seeing Scout on the ground behind the barn, the chain half buried, the bobcat he'd once carried out of a fire now needing to be carried again. At the gate, Ryan stepped out first, eyes moving over the yard with the kind of slow attention Caleb recognized from his own ranger days. No rush, no dramatics, just looking. "Show me where you found her," Ryan said. They walked behind the barn together. The ground there was a mix of thawed mud and refrozen patches, the kind that holds a story if you know how to read it. Caleb pointed to the cottonwood, the shallow depression where Scout had lain, the spot where he'd dug out the chain. Ryan crouched, gloved fingers tracing the edges of boot prints Caleb hadn't even seen the day before. He began to explain what he was seeing in a calm, steady voice. "Recent," he murmured. "Within a week, maybe less. 2 sets of prints, one heavier. See how deep the heel goes? Whoever it was, they were carrying weight." He followed the trail a few yards toward the tree line and back, marking spots with orange flags. By the fence, he found a scrap of canvas snagged on a nail, stiff and stained with something chemical. Near the base of the cottonwood, half hidden in dead grass, he spotted it. A tiny plastic dart. The syringe empty. "That," he said, holding it in his palm, "doesn't come from hikers taking pictures of a bobcat. That's homemade. Wrong type for any legal team in this region." The explanation landed heavier than the words themselves. This wasn't a case of someone stumbling on a wild animal and panicking. This was planned. Someone had come onto the land, tranquilized a bobcat, chained her behind the barn, and left her there to fend for herself. Caleb felt a slow heat climb his neck. Not the sharp, rushing anger the old Caleb might have ridden straight into trouble. This was something more tired and deep. A sense that the valley he thought he knew had a bruise he hadn't seen. The example came later that week at a town meeting in the community hall. Folding chairs, coffee in paper cups. Ryan stood at the front, explaining that Scout wasn't the only one. A young hawk had gone missing from a neighbor's property, 2 foxes from another county, and a collared mountain lion that had stopped transmitting its location. Patience, not accidents. An older rancher at the back of the room spoke up, voice rough. "We've run cattle on this land since my granddad rode it," he said. Bobcats, hawks, owls, they were always part of the deal. You lose one to a bad winter or a bigger predator, that's nature. But this? He lifted his hand toward the map Ryan had taped up. This is theft. From the animals. From all of us. In that moment, the room understood something together. The harm wasn't just to a single bobcat. It was to the shared trust that wild neighbors could move through these hills without becoming someone's secret property. The reflection that followed was soft but steady. Pain that's hidden doesn't stay small. It spreads, in bodies, in families, in landscapes. Naming it is the first step toward mending, and a fresh perspective began to take root in Caleb's mind. He'd always thought of himself as a man who protected forests from fire. Now, he was being asked to protect the wild hearts who lived inside those forests from a different kind of threat. Quiet, greedy, and deliberate. A small lesson settled in. Paying attention is an act of care. Reading tracks in the snow, noticing a missing hawk, listening when someone says, "Something's off here." Those are the first lines of defense for creatures who can't file their own reports. As the meeting broke up, people lingered in small clusters, talking not just about what had been done, but about what they could do next. Letters, calls, watchful eyes on back roads and creek bottoms. Caleb stepped outside into the cold evening, looking back toward the dark ridge where Scout once hunted. He knew now that rescue by itself wasn't enough. She'd need a place to heal. Others would too. In the next part of this story, we'll return to the homestead as it slowly turns into something new. A small sanctuary where a ranger, a bobcat, and a handful of ordinary people begin building a safer path forward. If this has stirred a quiet protectiveness in you, keep walking with us. There's more gentle, important work ahead. Most days at Scouts Crossing don't look amazing from the outside. They start with a porch light clicked on before sunrise, a thermos of coffee, and boots crossing frosted ground. But inside those quiet hours, a ranger, a bobcat, and a handful of neighbors are slowly rebuilding more than fences. That's our mini hook. One ordinary day in a small sanctuary that's quietly changing lives. Scouts Crossing grew out of Caleb's old homestead after the investigation began. What used a path that curves past a creek where the water keeps talking, even when the snow lies heavy. It's not fancy. It's not big. But for one recovering bobcat and a few other injured wild neighbors, it's enough. Mornings belong to Eleanor. She arrives with a canvas bag on her shoulder and a tune on her lips, the same way she once opened her classroom door. Her steps are slower now, but steady. She measures out meat for the bobcat, checks the chart Grace left taped to the wall, and hums as she sets the bowls in place. At Scout's enclosure, she pauses. Scout is perched on a low platform, winter coat thick, amber eyes half-lidded, as she watches a shaft of light slide across the straw. "Morning, girl," Eleanor says, voice gentle. "I finally called my youngest last night. We talked for a whole half hour." She doesn't expect a reaction, but Scout flicks one ear, then stretches, patting down to sniff the food before turning back toward the trees beyond the fence. For Eleanor, that tiny acknowledgement feels like a nod from an old friend. A retired teacher and an aging bobcat are both learning that there are still new conversations to have. Midday, Marcus pulls in with a slow crunch of gravel. He heads to the hawk enclosure, moving with a care that would surprise the men who once watched him throw chains over a loaded logging truck. The red tail inside was brought in with a fractured wing. Today, Marcus checks the perch, replaces a worn branch, and speaks in a low, even tone as he works. "Storms don't last forever," he tells the bird, though the words fit him too. "You just ride 'em out best you can." Caleb joins him for a moment, leaning against the fence. They talk about sleep, or the lack of it, about waking up to old memories, and how having chores here pulls them both out of their heads for a while. Nothing is solved. Nothing needs to be. The hawk fluffs its feathers and settles, the way your own shoulders might ease when someone simply sits beside you. Later, when school lets out, Nora and a couple of friends arrive to help Caleb with a new climbing structure for the fox enclosure. They argue good-naturedly over where to place a branch, then fall quiet when they notice Scout watching them from her corner. The bobcat's gaze is intent, not tame, wild, but calm, present. As the day fades, the sanctuary shifts into its softest gear. Caleb walks the main path, listening. Creek over rocks, wind in pine needles, a distant owl. The soft scuff of Scout's paws as she circles her space once before settling under a pine trunk. Most evenings, he and whoever's still there gather by the creek for 1 minute of shared silence. No speeches, just standing together, letting the sound of water and wind do the talking. If you're watching this at home, you might feel your own breathing match that rhythm for a moment. That's not an accident. Places like this change more than the animals. They change the people who are willing to listen. The fresh perspective Scouts Crossing offers is quiet, but powerful. You don't have to arrive fixed to belong. The bobcat with a scarred leg, the veteran with shaky hands, the teacher who thought her useful days were behind her. They all have a place in this small web of care. Maybe the small lesson tucked inside this day is this. Real rescue isn't one dramatic moment. It's breakfast dishes washed, enclosures checked, water buckets filled, and a bobcat's eyes blinking slowly in your direction. Again and again. It's staying. What Caleb and his neighbors don't see yet is how far this little sanctuary will reach. Because beyond the fences and the creek, Scout's story is about to step into a wider world of letters, phone calls, and strangers who feel oddly at home in this place they've never visited. In the next part, we'll walk with Caleb as he opens Scout's Crossing to the outside through a simple post and a handful of hard, honest conversations, and see how one bobcat's journey begins to touch people far beyond Willow Bend. If this day inside the sanctuary has brought a bit of calm to your own, you're welcome to stay with us as the circle gently widens. Some stories stay inside a fence line. Scout's didn't. The mini hook in this part is simple. A ranger, a bobcat, and a small sanctuary that suddenly finds itself talking to people far beyond the Montana hills it was built to serve. It began on a windy afternoon at Caleb's kitchen table. A stack of printed photos lay between his elbows. Scout as a soot-smudged kit years ago. Scout standing strong again on a ridge. Scout wrapped in a blanket the day he found her chained behind the barn. Outside the window, her enclosure sat quiet under the pines. Inside, his phone buzzed with a message from Nora. "You should tell people," she'd written. "Not for attention, for the other animals." Caleb had never been someone who shared much. Years on the fire line taught him to keep his head down, do the work, and move on. But the investigation had already uncovered missing foxes, a hawk, and other wildlife taken from these valleys. The more he thought about that dart, that chain, the more he knew silence would not protect anyone now. So he opened a blank post and started typing. He explained in plain words that he was a retired ranger who had once rescued a young bobcat from a wildfire, and that she'd become a quiet presence around his place. He wrote how he'd found her again years later, chained and abandoned, and how the small clinic and the people of Willow Bend had helped pull her back from the edge. He didn't name suspects. He didn't demand outrage. He simply described what had happened, why it mattered, and what Scout's Crossing was trying to do for injured wildlife. He ended with one soft line. "If you've ever had an animal who carried you through something hard, you understand why we're trying so hard to carry her now." He hit post, then set the phone down and went out to clean water buckets. The explanation of what happened next didn't come in a flood. It came in ripples. Friends in the valley shared his words. Then an old crewmate from his ranger days posted it. A veterans group picked it up. A small wildlife nonprofit in another state shared a link to Scout's Crossing. The example that made it real for Caleb arrived in the form of letters and messages. A retired nurse from Iowa wrote, "My old tabby cat sat with me through my husband's chemo. He's gone now, but that cat taught me more about presence than any counseling session. Thank you for what you're doing for this bobcat." A veteran in Ohio said, "I haven't stepped into a VA waiting room in 5 years, but I'd show up to muck stalls with you. Animals don't ask for explanations." A grandmother from Florida sent a drawing her grandson made of a bobcat resting under a pine tree, with the words, "Safe now," written in wobbly marker. At the same time, hard questions began to arrive, with kindness. Is it right to keep a wild animal in captivity, even in a sanctuary? How do we know Scout is living a good life behind a fence? What can someone in a city apartment possibly do to help? Grace and Caleb talked. These threw on the porch more than once, mugs cooling in their hands. Grace reminded him that Scout's age, her damaged leg, and her history with humans made a full return to the backcountry dangerous for her and for other wildlife. The sanctuary wasn't a petting zoo. It was the best compromise they could offer. Room to climb, stalk, and choose when to be seen, with safe care close by. When people wrote asking what they could do, Caleb tried to answer like he was talking to a neighbor at the grocery store, rather than an audience. Check if there's a wildlife rehab center near you. Maybe they need towels, or birdseed, or someone to answer phones. Be cautious of roadside exotic shows that treat wild animals like props. When in doubt, don't buy a ticket. Spend time in whatever wild corners you have. A city park, a lake, a trail. The more we feel connected to those places, the harder it is to ignore their need. The reflection that rose through all of this was gentle but clear. Scout's suffering, as painful as it was, had become a bridge between ranchers and city folks, between veterans and school teachers, between people who thought their own private hurts had nothing to do with a bobcat in Montana, until her story touched something tender in them. A fresh perspective formed around that kitchen table, telling the truth about pain, an animal's or a person's, is not about spreading sadness. It's about giving others a chance to respond with what goodness they have. The small lesson here is one you might recognize in your own life. You never know how far one honest story will travel, or who it might reach right when they need it. A ranger thought he was just updating friends. Instead, he opened a doorway for grieving hearts, tired hands, and quiet helpers to walk through. As winter began to lean toward spring again, Caleb stood by the fence one evening, letters stacked thick on his desk inside. Scout moved under the pine log, older now but steady. Somewhere in those hills, the scars of past wildfires were softening under new growth. In the next part, we'll step into a season where fire, snow, and time itself complete a circle, where Caleb meets the force that once nearly took his life on new terms, and where Scout's journey moves toward its most tender chapter. If anything in these letters feels like it brushed against your own story, you're welcome to keep walking with us. There's a quiet kind of closure ahead that might be good to sit with. Some circles don't close with a bang. They close with a line of low fire, a drift of quiet snow, and a gate that doesn't look dramatic at all, unless you know what it means. That's where we find Caleb and Scout now. A year after he'd found the bobcat chained behind his barn, Caleb stood on a ridge above Willow Bend, watching a controlled burn creep through dry grass. Flames moved slowly and steadily, no taller than his knees. A crew walked alongside the line, calm, talking in low voices. The sky was blue, not orange. Radios crackled, but nobody was shouting. He'd been asked to consult because of his ranger years, to help choose the safest path for the fire. The explanation for why he said yes was simple. The thing that had nearly taken his life and Scout's still needed to be part of this land. Fire that's tended protects forests from fire that rages. As he watched, the heat pressed against his face. For a moment, old memories stirred. The roar, the panic, the crewmate's voice cutting out. His chest tightened. And then he heard another sound underneath it all. Wind moving through pine tops. A meadowlark is calling from the fence. A crew member's easy laugh. He grounded his hand on the hood of the truck the way Grace had taught him in the clinic. Named what was in front of him, not behind him. The flames below weren't chasing anyone. They were doing their work and moving on. That was the first example of the circle closing. A ranger standing before fire on his own terms. Respect instead of terror. Partnership instead of battle. Back at Scout's crossing, winter edged in again. Scout was older now. Her coat was thick, but her movements were slower. On cold mornings, she favored the leg that had once worn that chain. Caleb felt his own body mirror hers. Knees that didn't like stairs, a back that complained after hauling buckets. He noticed how often they both paused halfway through getting up, taking that extra second before committing to the motion. A man and a bobcat, aging under the same sky. One morning, snow had fallen softly in the night, laying a light blanket on the sanctuary. The creek still whispered under thin ice. Caleb walked the path he knew by heart, breath hanging in front of him, hands tucked into his coat. He found Scout near the back of her enclosure, beneath a bent pine trunk where she liked to rest. Frost dusted the log. Her eyes followed him as he came closer, then softened. That slow blink cats give when they recognize someone as theirs, in whatever way wild hearts use that word. He sat down in the snow just outside the fence, not calling to her, not asking her to move. After a moment, she rose, walked the short distance with careful steps, and settled near him, separated by the wire but close enough that he could feel her warmth. The reflection that settled over that scene was quiet. They had carried each other through more seasons than anyone expected. Fire, chains, clinics, letters, long nights. Somewhere along the way, fear had turned into a kind of companionship neither of them had words for. As the sun climbed, Scout's breathing grew slower. There was no drama to it, no thrashing, no panic, just the long, gentle exhale of a life that had been fought for many times, now easing toward rest. Caleb stayed where he was, one hand resting lightly against the fence, matching his breathing to hers as best he could. When the time came, it came like a snowflake melting on your glove. Small, soft, final. Her chest simply didn't rise for the next breath. He bowed his head. Grief came, but not like a storm, more like a tide, steady, deep, bringing memories with it. The burnt kit in his arms, the wild bobcat on a ridge, the chained body behind the barn. The strong cat watches as teenagers build a fox perch, all of it held in the same pair of amber eyes. The fresh perspective that morning was this: not all open gates are made of metal. Sometimes the open gate is inside you, the point where you stop fighting what life has taken and start carrying what it gave. For Caleb, the small lesson was one he could feel in his bones. Love doesn't keep anything from changing. It simply walks alongside the changing as faithfully as it can. Later that day, the community gathered for a simple goodbye under a spruce near Scout's enclosure. Stones from favorite trails, pine cones from backyards, and a few handwritten notes slid into the fence. No speeches, just a shared silence that felt like a blanket. Snow began to fall again as folks drifted home. The sanctuary seemed somehow both emptier and more full, because Scout's story didn't end in that enclosure. In the last part of this journey, we'll step into what came after. A valley shaped by one bobcat's courage, a sanctuary finding its long stride, and the quiet ways her life might reach into your own. If you feel able, stay with us for that final chapter. There's something gentle waiting there about legacy and about the wild hearts, animal and human, that have shaped who you are. Some lives leave their mark in headlines and statues. Scout's didn't. Her legacy settled into a valley the way fresh snow settles onto pine branches. Quietly, steadily, until one day everyone realized the shape of things had changed. That's our mini hook for this last chapter. How one wounded bobcat reshaped a place, and how her story might quietly reach into your life too. In the work she started didn't end when she was gone, because it never really was just about her. It was about what she awakened in the people who watched her fight, heal, and age with a kind of fierce gentleness. Eleanor, she touches the trunk, says a few words no one else hears, then goes on to check charts and warm food for the new arrivals. When a young fox paces nervously in a corner, she talks to him about her grandkids and the phone calls she's no longer afraid to make. Marcus guides small groups of veterans along the sanctuary path, telling them about the first time he held a hawk with a broken wing and realized his own shaking hands had finally steadied. He points out where Scout used to sit when teenagers hammered together perches and platforms, and he says, "That old girl taught me I still had jobs left to do." Nora, the girl with the roadside photograph, now sends envelopes every month to people who wrote from far away. Inside are simple prints: a bobcat track in mud, the curve of the creek at dusk, a close-up of a wild eye peering through grass. She tucks in a line or two about the animal's story, about the sanctuary, about how their small donation helped one more life get a second chance. Out beyond the sanctuary fence, change quietly took root too. Laws shifted. Illegal wildlife trade in the region became harder to hide. Folks who might once have looked the other way when they saw a traveling show with a caged cat now paused, thought twice, and walked on. The more people heard Scout's story, the more they understood that a bobcat is not a prop. She's a neighbor. She's part of the land's heartbeat. The soft, emotional reflection in all of this is that healing rarely belongs to just one body. When Caleb carried Scout out of that wildfire years ago, and then again off the frozen ground behind his barn, he thought he was saving a wild animal. What he couldn't see then was how many people she would end up carrying along with her. Out of numbness, out of loneliness, out of the feeling that their best, most useful days were behind them. The fresh perspective Scout leaves us with is this: you don't need a sanctuary in your backyard or a ranger's badge on your coat to be part of this kind of legacy. You just need a willingness to notice, to care, and to act in the small circle you can reach. Maybe, as you've listened, someone has come to mind. A dog who sat with you through a hard winter, a barn cat who followed your every step, a wild deer you used to see at the edge of the field, or a person, a grandparent, a friend, a neighbor, whose presence helped you through a season that felt like a fire. Before this video ends, I'd like to invite you to do something gentle for yourself. Take a quiet breath. Think of that animal or that person. Notice what they gave you that you still carry. A bit of courage, a softer heart, the reminder that you weren't alone. Let that memory sit with you for a moment. The way Scout used to sit at the edge of the trees, not asking anything, just being there. If this story of a ranger and a bobcat, of wildfire and sanctuary, has brought you even a little comfort or hope, I'd be grateful if you'd tap like and subscribe. It helps this small corner of the internet stay lit for others who might be up late, looking for something gentle to rest their heart on. And if you feel moved to go one step further, you're welcome to send a warm super thanks or donate through the link below. Your kindness helps real people rescue and heal wild animals like bobcats, hawks, and foxes, the quiet neighbors who share our world and sometimes help us find our way back to ourselves. Thank you for walking this path with Scout. Her story lives on every time someone chooses compassion over indifference, and every time someone like you decides that even a small act of care is worth doing.